Excellent.
Well, hello and welcome again. Once again, this is our 8th series of conversations for the Christian Life at Resurrection Parish and the Adult Formation Program. We are so delighted today to have with us Father Daniel Hombergen. Okay. Father Daniel Hombergen. And he's going to tell us a little bit about himself first. Thank you so much for being with us, Father. We really appreciate that.
Yeah.
So tell me, who are you and how did you come to this lovely part of the world?
I will do my best to keep it a little bit short.
Don't worry about that.
Yeah. Well, I'm Dutch, born in the Netherlands, but when I was a 3.5 years old kid, my family, my parents, and also one sister and 2 younger brothers, the youngest was only a few months old, we moved to the Caribbean, to Curacao, the island of Curacao, and that's where I grew up.
Oh my goodness.
Yes. And then when I was 19, I went back to the Netherlands. In the meantime, we had visited the Netherlands twice.
Sure.
But I went really back to do some studies when I was 19.
19.
And the first thing that I did was I was educated to become a teacher in drawing. Drawing, yes.
You're an artist.
Because, well, that would be very strong, but at least that was how I began. But what interested me very much was art history and history of culture.
Oh, of course.
So that was all. And as a little kid, I was also very pious. That's also very important.
Sure.
And for example, I still remember when I did my first communion, it was really very intense.
Yeah.
But later when I grew older, of course, there were doubts coming up. Also the time, it was the 60s, with so many critical questions, etc.
Yes.
So when I came in the Netherlands, and also there was also a cultural shift in the Netherlands. So it was a sort of, in the beginning it felt much like being liberated, but finally it was also very difficult to find a real direction in life. And it was only, well, a lot happened, but at a certain moment when I was in my mid-20s, in a very strong experience, Jesus Christ came back into my life.
Excellent.
So that's very important.
Yes.
And then, so I started, I was already teaching. I was teaching both drawing and cultural history. But I started to have strong interest in monasteries. It was in the late 70s.
And this is in your 20s?
I was in my 20s, yeah.
Okay.
Finally, I joined the Norbertins in the Netherlands.
Oh, really?
There is a Norbertin monastery. But as a novice, it became already clear that the contemplative life was
much more drawn to you.
I was really drawn. I had some sort of guilt. How can you cannot afford to separate from the world when there is so much suffering, etc., etc. So you should be active. But that was and guilt. So it was also a sort of purification. And then finally, I ended up with the Trappists in the Netherlands in the monastery of Zundert. Zundert
in the Netherlands.
Yes, it is in the south of the Netherlands.
Okay.
I also, where I was born, was also the south.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, when you talk about patristics,
yes.
What does that mean? To someone who doesn't know anything about that particular phrase or whatnot, what does it mean?
Yeah. Patristics, well, the name is derived from pater, which means father, and just by tradition we call all those authors, especially authors who have written, who left written works, they are called fathers and fathers of the church. And then patrology or patristics, that's the discipline to study them. And it is so overwhelming much that no one, even the highest professors, are not able to cover everything because
it's huge.
Yes, that's right.
Catalog.
That's right. So there is so much writing, and also there is also the difficulty of the transmission of the text, because nowadays we have printed books, but for centuries their works were just handwritten, and then in the monasteries of the Middle Ages on very cold scriptoria, the monks were just transcribing.
All those transcriptions.
And they, of course, sometimes they were a little bit sleepy, and so they made mistakes, and then another one started to correct, and then in the margin there were there were comments, and the next one you would put the comment into the original text, etc. So after a couple of centuries, you can imagine that the text. So nowadays, but I never did that. But really, that is text criticism. That's very also for the Bible. But Bible is very, very precise, especially the Hebrew Bible. But the patristic texts. They went through so many centuries of monasteries, but also in different places. So there are almost always there are a lot of different manuscripts. And the experts, they go all over the world to collect at least copies of the manuscripts, and then they put all these texts together, and then they can reconstruct as much as possible close to the original text. But then always in a sort of footnote, they put in a sort of code, they write how the so-called variants, the text variants are. Certainly. And that's the way how we get all the texts of the church fathers. Origen and also Gregory of Nazianzen, Gregory of Nyssa, Basil the Great, but also Saint Benedict, who wrote the Rule.
Well, when you talk about the fathers, if you're probably starting, I would presume, like 3rd century, maybe AD, 3rd century.
Yes. Well, the oldest. Well, the fathers. So the monastic fathers, you could say that's just one chapter of the whole patristic. But the church fathers, it starts already immediately at the end of the 1st century already.
Of course.
With Saint Clement of Rome.
I was thinking Clement and Caesarea.
And then we have Ignatius of Antioch, who's also in the beginning of the 2nd century, and Papias, and so there are many names. And then there is, for example, a beautiful treatise on the martyrdom of Polycarpus, which was also in the mid-2nd century.
It was 2nd century.
But the difference, the difficult, and Irenaeus at the end of the 2nd century, also very important author. The problems that started already at the end of the 1st century, when the time gap between the eyewitnesses of Jesus and when they started dying by the end of the 1st century, then of course there was it was all what they knew about Jesus was indirect, because it was by written text that did already exist, or it was hearsay. And there was of course a lot of legends were also developing about Jesus, but also all kinds of speculations, which sometimes were very wild. So there was also in the beginning of the 2nd century, there was already this urge that to try to purify what do we really agree upon, what we should believe, and what falls outside the boundaries of what we believe. Yeah.
Oh well, and that really brings me down to where we are today and what we were talking about.
Yes.
I should do this once again. Of course, we're on Father Pagola's book on Jesus, a historical approximation, and I have asked Father Daniel to take a look, especially at the chapter on Jesus as the prophet of the reign of God. And we were talking before we began filming, we were talking about the whole motion through the ages, actually, thousands of ages, tens of thousands of ages, how we gradually would come down to the time of Jesus, and then where did it go from there? And that's what you're talking about. Where did it go at that point? How did that begin to play out, for instance, in others? Talk to us about how, for instance, something like the reign of God may have played out in the early fathers and mothers of the church.
Yes. Wow.
Because we're looking at the idea of ethical morality.
Yes.
That's going to be, some of that is going to be encased, I would presume, I guess, within their writings and what they had to say, how do we live?
Yes.
And that's really what morality is all about, of course.
Yes, that's right. How do we live, and also how do we, because also in this book, in the chapter that I read, certainly. We see there's also a lot of evil, and of course you could say you could do it like this: people are bad, etc. But that is very pessimistic, so that could be depressing. But evil means also when we follow the news, we see there is so much evil going on also nowadays.
Sure.
The difficulty is that evil happens outside myself in the whole world, but when I am very honest and I look in the mirror and I start an introspection, I can also discover that potentially all these evil passions are also potentially present in my own heart. And of course they can be triggered, and of course I have a free will, so I can also resist, etc., etc. So that's important to know that, especially in the third, it happened already at the end of the 3rd century. Yes, that it's the time of the decline of the Roman Empire, which means that many people who are already Christian, because the Christianity was still persecuted at the end of the 3rd century. But now I'm thinking about the figure of Anthony the Great. Anthony, he was born in 251, which was still the time of the persecutions.
Yes.
And also Christianity had already become very strong, and these were the final persecutions in which the emperor still tried to suppress this new religion. But slightly over 300, in the early 300s, then there was Constantinus, and he is a very important emperor because he understood that it was not possible to suppress Christianity. So he started with allowing the religion of Christianity, which means that suddenly it became much more easy. Now I'm trying to summarize a very complicated process. In the beginning you really needed to be very fervent and very, because you could risk your life to become a Christian. Which means that the standards were also the moral standards were very high. But when in the 4th century, so in the 300s, when it became, in the beginning it was tolerated, it was also a very popular religion, and finally by the end of the 4th century it became even the official religion of the whole Roman Empire. So that's the development that I try to summarize. And within this context, formerly, the highest way of following Christ was the martyrdom. Every now and then there were persecutions, and Tertullian, he wrote, "The blood of the martyrs is the seed of the church," which is also a very famous phrase, in which so that also explains a little bit the mood of those people who had to fight for, even for their lives, but also for their ideals, etc. In the 4th century, when masses of people converted and became Christians, then it also tended to be a little bit more eroded or easy, etc. But then, as a reaction, there were many young men, also women, but in the beginning especially men, who wanted because the gospel, as Jesus also in a chapter that you asked me to read, it's a very radical message.
It is.
Jesus is very radical. So if you want, you cannot do it in a sort of easy way. When you really want to seriously follow Jesus Christ, and there were a lot of young men who wanted, especially in the background of the collapsing Roman Empire, which gave no perspective anymore. So those fervent followers of Christ, there was a whole movement of renouncing the world, going on a distance into the desert, especially Egyptian desert, but also in Syria and in Palestine and even in Cappadocia, but also in the west, in the south of what is nowadays France, in Gaul. So that are the places, but especially in Egypt is the most important thing, because there was Saint Anthony and also Pachomius. These were the great initiators of the monastic movement.
Wow. Well, so
it was a spontaneous movement. That's also very important. So it was not something like some guy who would say, let I start founding monastery. That's not how it worked. It was a sort of spontaneous movement.
Well, and with Benedict, I mean, he had kind of separated himself to live his own life, and then all of a sudden there were these other people that showed up who wanted to live a life similar.
Yeah, and then of course he had to regulate, and that's also what happened in the monasteries of Pachomius, which were hugely crowded monasteries in the south of Egypt, where Pachomius and also his let us say his assistants, they needed really to organize, because when you are living with hundreds or even thousands of people in multiple monasteries, then you need to have good structures. So that was needed, but it was a consequence of a movement that started spontaneously.
That's just great.
And what's the real reason? And that's also where we come also closer to our chapter, of chapter 4. it had, of course, all these inspired people. They were also faced with a lot of human failure in their society, because the whole, also on a moral level, but not only moral in the sense that so many sins are committed, but also in the structure doesn't work, etc. But at the same time, when you really reflect, you can also discover that all these things that are going on, all these power struggles and egos that are just fighting one another, but it is all potentially also in my own heart. And if I really want to follow Christ, or to be connected, or to stay united with Christ, this is not a simple question of, oh, I follow Jesus. No, it is. You have to go to a very profound process of interior purification. And what's very important is I cannot do that just with my mere own forces. I need to do it with the mercy of God. So that's also where prayer comes in.
Certainly.
So
of course, yes,
that's
yes.
how a whole tradition of ascetical practice developed. Inner purification. But the purification is not something like, so look, now I'm totally pure of heart, now I'm a saint, because then you become similar to the Pharisees.
Yes, exactly. Yeah,
so you have to be careful. So what's also very important, and that's what we also read very much underlined in the rule of Saint Benedict, but Benedict is already in the 6th century, but he also very strongly underlines the humility. So you need to do it without pretensions. You could not, because if I would say I'm a saint, that's already the proof that I'm not a saint.
Sure, of course. Yeah. It's a tricky proposition.
When I say who am I, etc., then perhaps you could, and especially when you say, well, I'm always, every day I fail, and when you read, for example, the little Thérèse of Lisieux, then we are in the 19th century.
Certainly.
The Thérèse of Lisieux, she has her little way, which is so strongly pretentiousness.
Yes, absolutely so.
And that's, and at the same time you feel the authenticity and the huge desire of her heart, which finally, and she, so what she writes is, on the one hand, ascetical practice, and also sometimes there were very harsh practices of monks who went, especially in Syria, monks who were doing all kinds of penitence.
Yes.
Also sometimes because they had a very strong fear of there is so much evil in the world and God must be very angry, so I'm going to do a lot of penitence just to reconcile.
Well, and that's exactly what we were talking about earlier. When all of this became more and more, I don't know about solidified or whatever, around a Christian ideal, as they saw Jesus at that particular time, only a few hundred years away from when he actually existed, how then does this notion that we have today of a Christian morality, for instance, or a Christian ethic, or a Christian how do I live my life, that's when that really is going to become front and center.
Yes.
And this is indeed what we're talking about, I think, with the reign of God.
Yeah.
And Jesus' concept of the reign of God.
Yeah.
Elaine Park, do you know Elaine? I'm sure you have met her.
Yes, I did. Also already many years ago, because I've been here several times just for a short time.
Yes,
she has been teaching also Mount Angel.
I think she did. Yes, in fact, she ran the program for quite a while. Yeah. She says that rather than kingdom of God, which she doesn't like that phrase, and reign of God, she likes to say instead the presence of God. That in fact, this is what Jesus was up to, the presence of God right here in your life, right here, not down the road somewhere or anything else. This is where God is. Which sounds like that plays right into what you're talking about with the idea of the patristics and who these people were, and completely consumed with the idea that God is right here, right now.
Yeah.
Seems like that's a huge step.
Yes, and there was also a very strong experience of, even when I am with so good intentions, etc., but I also at the same time experience of I'm standing in the way with all my imperfections. I'm standing in the way for and when you would speak about the kingdom of God, that's also a lot of discussion. We have very soon, not tomorrow, but a week from now, we have also this solemnity of Christ the King.
Christ the King.
And there are people who are really that you should not call him a king.
Yes, exactly, absolutely.
But there is a lot of misunderstanding about because a king is, of course, it's not a dictator.
Yes.
It's an especially Jesus. If you read the Gospel and finally also how Jesus ended up. Finally, with the crucifixion, etc. Yes. And then it's very strongly in the Gospel of Saint John that there is a sort of paradox. Pilate, finally, when Pilate had lost the battle, because Pilate was convinced that he was a very bad man, but he was at least he knew that Jesus was innocent.
He was innocent of what he was doing.
But at a certain moment, when they start threatening, we are going to the emperor, then Pilate, and then of course he yielded.
No, he couldn't. And
then afterwards, so he has sort of lost his face against the Jewish people, and he didn't have any sympathy to the Jewish people at all.
None.
So at the fire, it was a sort of blow afterwards that he would put on the cross, "This is your king."
Yeah.
And it was the most horrible death,
etc.,
etc. And then the paradox is that Saint John, he also it's the very strong line in his gospel that Pilate had intended it as an insult to the whole, especially to the leaders of the Jewish people.
Yes.
But John said, "This is the truth." And Pilate, he himself said, "What is truth?" But truth is this is the king. And it was meant as an insult, but on a deeper level, it was the truth, because Jesus is. But if you want to have a real king, not a king of power and a king of violence and war, etc., what we are seeing nowadays, it's a king of love. And then the basic of our Christian faith is that we believe somehow that this. And then you could say kingdom, but it is not a kingdom, and especially exactly what he writes is not a kingdom of power, not even power to impose justice, but it is the power of the vulnerability.
Well, and
it's a
absolutely.
But it is a kingdom.
It is a kingdom,
and the kingdom is also in the heart of each of us.
Well, and that's the thing. As I'm going back with Father Pagola again.
That's our point.
That same notion that it's within you. And it's not just within you, like it's locked up inside of you. It's inside and outside, and it's all around.
That's right.
But it's only made real in you.
Yes, that's right.
That would seem to me to be talking about the flow of our whole series with this the notion of ethics coming gradually into the consciousness of Homo sapiens. That's a key part of it. Because even Jesus had a hard time selling this notion to some people that no, I'm not coming to beat up on anybody. That's not the point. The point is the kingdom is already here.
It's already
the presence is already here. It's already in you.
Yes.
How are you going to act in that?
Yeah.
And it would appear to me, and you can tell me what you think in terms of the early church or whatever, that's been a very difficult thing for people to accept and to learn how to live in. Right down to our present day, when there's a very strange, I think, breakdown of who Jesus really was and what he really was intending. I may be wrong, but this strikes me as kind of that way within our own society right now. It's just absolutely fascinating. And I thought one of the things that Father Pagola brings up also is that notion that Jesus had to kind of come to this eventually. This is a process that he had to go through himself. A lot of it we don't know how, like the secret life of Jesus. But at the same time, it was a process for him as well as it is for us.
A human process. Yes, that's nowadays, but of course there's a lot of controversy over it, and also it has to do with also the tension between Jesus is, well, like Michael Casey would say it, he's fully divine and fully human.
Yes, yeah.
When you are fully human, which means it is not, it was also in the old church already, there were all kinds of speculations, as if he was a sort of angel coming down from heaven, and he had not a real body, because that would be too insulting.
Couldn't happen,
well, there would be so much to say about it, but the most important thing is that Jesus was a real human being. If he was a real human being, then he was born as a little kid, just as a toddler.
Yes, yeah.
And then he had to learn. And he was also born from a woman. And we believe that it is a virginal birth. And He had to develop, which means that I always exaggerated by saying when he was laying in the cradle, if you would overstress he is God. Of course he is, totally, it's God, but it is the humility of God, and it is not the, and there's also another thing, it is the Son of the, of course there's also a paradox and also a mystery, because we have the Trinity, but it is the Son, unum ex Trinitate, unus ex Trinitate, which means just one out of the Trinity, and at the same time you cannot split them, but you cannot confuse them. So that's also the difficulty in the ancient church. You have been working on the creed, so
yes,
but it's the Son who goes down to the incarnation, who becomes a human being, but he became totally like us, except Son. Except sin, which means that as a child he had just a normal process of education, and as a human with a human psychology, he needed to come to terms with what he discovered in himself, etc. So to a certain extent I can follow him. For example, on a certain page he wrote, Jesus didn't know very well Greek. And then many people might be scandaled because, but he is God, he should know everything. All the. But if you would exaggerate that, then when he is laying as a baby in the cradle, he should have already have all the science of Einstein and way much more that we don't know about the cosmos, and he should already totally know all that.
He was just pretending that he was a baby.
And he was just and then you come in all these what we call nowadays heresies.
Yes.
This docetism especially.
Absolutely.
Docetism, which means it is just in appearance, it is just seemingly, but in reality he was. No, you have to take seriously to the very end that he was a human being, which means that to a certain extent he must have had also just a human development, and also that he came to an insights that he didn't have as a younger, and also with all the things, especially the disappointing experiences that the officials of his people didn't accept him, and they even rejected him, etc.
Yes.
He must also, I think, he must have been very strong sense and an unimaginable sense of reality, which means you could also, as a very young man, you were totally idealistic, but I don't think that could be also an exaggerated image of Jesus, that he was totally idealistic, and then he was totally beaten aback because of the cold reception, etc. He must have known, by intuition, he must have known already very much that. From the pages of the Gospel, we have a very strong portrait of that Jesus. He didn't have any illusion. He was very real, etc. But at the same time, he was totally in a way that we cannot fathom, and that is also where of course his divinity comes in. This connection with the Father, that is most profoundly expressed by St. John. But even then, it is for us very difficult to get access to these mysterious texts of St. John, because he was a human being, totally as we, and at the same time he had. And we, all of us, we have a part of this connection already potentially, but in him it was, of course, uncomparable.
Well, and also, from what you're saying about this, the learning process that he would have gone through, there are some that I've read, right or wrong, I don't know, that perhaps he had to come to a point of realizing he was more than just a human growing on the regular path. And perhaps one of the biggest moments was at the baptism. When all of a sudden it's like, what? What? This a gigantic experience for him. In fact, I think Father Pagoli even refers to that at one point, that must have been perhaps quite a jolt even for him to suddenly realize, oh my gosh, there's more at stake here than I had imagined.
And another thing, but it is, well, when I was reading this book, I was, so he makes Jesus very human, and I very much appreciate it, and at the same time I still have to read this book of Michael Casey, which is the title, Fully Divine and Fully Human.
Fully human, fully divine.
Because that has always been one of the greatest tensions of the Christian faith, to put the two together.
How does that work? Exactly. Well, and there's nothing we can try to understand it. We can read about it, write about it, and all the rest. We can contemplate on it and all the rest. But in reality, we really don't know anything like that.
No, we will
That's
never
not something
totally
we know.
fathom. We will never
Yeah.
totally.
That's when we talk
fathom
about
what
the
it was.
existence
Yeah.
of God and the creation
Yeah.
of the universe.
Yeah.
We don't know of anything that can,
Yeah.
in fact, be responsible for its own existence. We don't know anything like that. That's way outside of our experience. So we're constantly confronted with that, I think, with Jesus
Yeah.
and what he has
And
to say.
his kingdom.
And his
Yeah.
kingdom.
Because we are also talking about the kingdom.
Absolutely.
And also this very understandable, this rejection that people say, I don't feel familiar with kingdom or whatever, because it smells like politics or power, etc. But the paradox is that the kingdom of Christ is totally based on human dignity, whereas the kingdom of God has to do with how are people just living together in total respect for the dignity of the other one, for example in a religious community or in a family or in whatever sort of human which means that as soon as I start from my ego trying to overpower or to push through my will, etc., then we are already on the sideline. So this is very, but also to grow to a level in which I'm just able to do so, that presupposes a very strong way, a lifelong way of inner purification. And that's where the whole wisdom of the monastic tradition comes in. The spiritual battle, the combat, because for example, I just mentioned Thérèse of Lisieux already. She is of course not of the time of the patristics, but she's a very good example of this inner this inner struggle, and also her limitations, especially when she got sick at a very young age, etc., and what she had to suffer. And then so all kinds of in the depth of our unconsciousness, there are so many passions and emotions and things that are coming up, and you cannot overcome them just by pressing them, and so as if they are not but on the other hand, you cannot just follow all of them, because then you end up with a sort of total disordered behavior or whatever. And that's also where we need to get in touch with our deepest vulnerability as a human being, and then from that level of frailty, cry to the Lord, "Oh Lord, help me!" And just like the tax collector who stood at the end of the
stood back and then
he stood back instead of the Pharisee who was boasting upon his righteousness, etc. And then this man, he was very well aware of what he was doing, because they were very important. Also, when you speak about the society, and Jesus, he did not only connect with the poor and the victims, etc., but he also made contact with those who are despised. So people were also offended, because he's speaking, he's eating and feasting with sinners.
What are you doing eating with these people? You can't do that. Well, it strikes me, I may be completely wrong on this, but think about this. Our natural impulse as humans, or part of the great apes or whatever, is to take care of ourselves.
Yes.
And whether in the time, a if we will, moral time or whatever, the focus was on your little tribe and your little group. Everything depended upon your survival.
Yeah.
But by the time we get to Jesus, it strikes me, and then continuing on past there, there is this huge place of almost getting rid of yourself, to where you had to come to a place of great internal humility. That was kind of one of the essential ingredients in following along the Christian way, was to come to an understanding of humility, where I did not have to be domineering, so that the kingdom of heaven or the reign of God did not have to be, we're going to knock you down, beat the stuff out of you.
Right.
No, it's a whole
and
different
especially
process.
the so-called struggle for life.
Yes.
So that is
because
that's also the whole development of the human race. There is the survival of the fittest, and that is of course a very strong law, especially in the kingdom of the animals. And then we human beings, we have it in our DNA, potentially.
Absolutely.
So in all kinds of situations, I will always try to, there is always this tendency, first myself, and then when there is something, when I have satisfied all my own needs, my
Exactly.
concupiscences, etc.
Absolutely.
Then I can also be a little bit Christian, etc.
Yeah.
But Jesus' message is much more radical.
It is much
He
more
ended
radical.
up on the cross, which means
Well, in his constant
he says,
urging that
who
the
does-
first will be last and the last will be
yes,
first.
and also who doesn't, how do you say that in correct English? Who doesn't deny himself will, know.
Mhm.
He says,
Mhm.
it's a sort of self-denial,
Yes.
but at the same time it's very important that it has nothing to do with, there could be, so we need, there's also the value of discernment. There could be also a sort of self-denial which would be unhealthy.
Mhm.
We are, because at the same time we have our dignity, or even our, how would I say that, our worthiness of human being, that is already there because God has wanted us. God has wanted you, God has wanted me, but I need to get in touch with this deepest. And I cannot conquer that by survival of the fittest, and I will
Yeah.
dominate others and then I get what I need, etc.
Yes.
Because then I'm self-centered. And that's all the difficulties, not only in our society, but also even with the wars that are going on, etc. It has all to do with this illusion of survival of the survival of the fittest. And what and that's also where morality comes in, that you decline to follow all these passions and these impulses because you want to create room also for others. We have a very nice example of even politics with someone who became very famous, but he was not a Christian, he was of India, he was Mahatma Gandhi.
Yeah, the Mahatma.
And we had already decades ago, we went with our monastery, we went to the bioscope, the cinema, just to watch the movie, because we did not have the things that you could do at a play,
Sure.
a video at
Of
home,
course,
etc.
yeah.
So many of the monks, we saw this movie, and at a certain moment I was totally impressed. And this man, he was Hindu, but
Yeah.
of course he knew also the Bible, he knew of course Christian culture, and he knew also the deviations of Christianity. He came from South Africa, where he had of course seen more than enough.
Certainly.
But at a certain moment there was a scene, that was a horrible scene, where there were many peaceful demonstrators and they were all gunned down.
Yes, they were annihilated. Yes. shot
Yes,
down.
and it was of course very, afterwards it was very sad. Then there is a moment of silence, and then you see Gandhi by this well where he looks into and then next he's sitting on the shore, you see the sea, and then he starts reflecting. Of course he must have been totally devastated, but
Yes.
at the same time,
Yes.
and he started, I don't remember exactly what he said, but at least what came to my mind, I was a Christian monk,
Mhm.
and I said, this man is more Christian than I am.
Yeah.
That was my reaction when I
Well, and I've often thought that his famous quotation that "be the change you want to see in the world"
yeah.
is so reflective
Yeah.
of
Yeah.
the life of Jesus.
Yeah,
So reflective of
Definitely,
early
definitely.
Christianity. So reflective even of some of the pre-Christian groups. I think of Socrates. With you
Yeah.
got to know who you are.
Mhm.
You have to know
Yeah.
yourself. If you don't know
Yeah.
who you are, what are you going to do?
yeah.
And so many things flow right down
Yeah,
into
know yourself is
that
very
exact
important.
piece.
Yes. Well, we are just trying to understand a little bit about evil, what's going on. Yeah, but
Well,
the
and
most
that's one of the
important thing is that it is potentially in each of us.
And one of the things that
Yes.
the Pagoli insists on, which I think is
Yeah.
fantastic, is that Jesus, in his work, he was not there to beat up on the Romans or oppose the Romans. His enemy was not Rome. His enemy was evil. And
Yes.
he saw God
Mhm.
as the anti-evil.
Yes.
This is where salvation
Yeah.
was. This is
Yeah.
where the reign had to occur within us,
Yeah, that's
in
right.
that very place.
Yes,
So that this
exactly.
anti-evil would,
And that
in
was-
fact, become
Yes,
effective.
and that was also why he did not follow all these stereotypes. When you have the tax collectors,
Yes,
and you have
yes,
the
yes, yes, yes,
harlots, and
Absolutely.
etc., and you have of course the Roman soldiers.
Mhm.
At a certain moment, there is a centurion. I think he
Yes.
comes.
Mhm.
He comes to Jesus, and
Yeah.
with a great face, and he is
Mhm.
the one who says, "I'm not worthy.
I'm not
that
worthy."
you come
Yeah.
under my roof."
Yeah.
And also, he's a man who is concerned with the well-being of one of his.
He was.
etc.
One of his
And then
servants.
Jesus says, in whole Israel didn't see the face.
I've never seen anything quite like this. Yeah, and here's this Roman
Yeah.
soldier.
So Jesus was always going just through all these stereotypes.
Yeah.
Always,
Yeah.
always.
Well, this has been wonderful. Thank you so much for
Yeah.
being with us today.
Yeah, it was very. I
Oh,
enjoyed
Father,
it very
this has been
much.
just absolutely, just fabulous. Any last thing you would like to say before we sign off for today?
Whew. Well, I hope that this conversation, but also all the conversations you had before,
Mhm.
that they will be somehow make a modest contribution to the well-being of all people who
That's
are
it.
watching.
That's it.
And perhaps it might sometimes for some people be a sort of eye-opener, because I can imagine nowadays that many people have difficulties, problems with their faith,
Certainly.
what I can very
Certainly.
well understand.
Yep.
But sometimes you need just an eye-opener and so,
I never would have thought of that. Wow, no
Yeah,
kidding.
so-
Yeah. Well, thank you again.
yeah, thank
This has
you
been
also.
absolutely
Thank you,
terrific.
Michael.
Perhaps
That's
we'll
good.
talk again. That would be wonderful.
Yeah, well, you would be welcome.
Thank
Yeah,
you.
yeah.
And thank all of you for being with us with this tremendous conversation with Father Daniel. We appreciate that very much. Look forward to the next time, and meanwhile, blessings always.